Hi there, and welcome back to Changing the Rules. I'm Jojo Mehta, Executive Director of Stop Ecocide International. And today we're welcoming Patrick Alley, co-founder of the NGO Global Witness, challenging abuses of power to protect human rights and secure the future of our planet. Patrick Alley has been chasing the bad guys and bringing them to justice for nearly 30 years now. And he's here today to talk about his work and how it intersects with our work to make ecocide an international crime. Patrick, it's lovely to see you again. Maybe we can start by just asking you a little bit about yourself. What brought you to what you're doing in the world? And can you tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about Global Witness?
I'll certainly do that, and do stop me if I drone on too much. Yeah, I mean, I had a skirmish with the world of commerce in my 20s, but my passion at that time, and we're going back to the late 80s, very early 90s, was environmental issues. And I finally left my real job, as my father always used to call it, and ended up working for the Environmental Investigation Agency in London. And their methodology was to carry out undercover investigations to get evidence to advocate for change. And they would look at things like the ivory trade, for example, or the slaughter of whales and dolphins. And I met two colleagues there, or two friends I made there, and we were all completely by coincidence interested in Cambodia. And at that time, Cambodia was in the news because the UN were brokering the first democratic elections for decades. Their largest peacekeeping mission ever at that time. They had 18,000 troops, no, 20,000 troops, I think, in Cambodia at the time. But the Khmer Rouge rebel group, the notorious genocidal Khmer Rouge, were boycotting elections. And we read press articles saying that the Khmer Rouge were trading timber with Thailand. And we asked ourselves a question. We said, well, is that an environmental issue because they're cutting down a rainforest, or is that a human rights issue because they must be funding the war with it? That must be why they're doing it. And at that time, no organization, and it's still largely true now, worked on that nexus between environmental and human rights issues, if you like, if you want to phrase it like that. And so you had Greenpeace doing what they do, Amnesty doing what they do, no one crossing that boundary. And we thought, with the techniques we knew from EIA, if you got information that could document that trade was funding a war and to what level, then maybe you could get the border closed between the two countries, and then maybe you cut the funding to the war. And we thought, why doesn't someone do that? And then we thought, well, why don't we? And we had, we were very, not the obvious candidates for the job. We were all young or youngish at the time, pretty inexperienced. We had no money. And nevertheless, we decided to do it. And it took us, 18 months to try and raise some funds. We were shaking cans outside tube stations, trying to get some money for international phone calls, all that sort of stuff. But finally, myself and my colleague Simon went off posing as timber buyers around the Thai-Cambodia border, knowing nothing about timber at all. But actually, it was surprisingly easy. People talked, and we managed to document this trade. Was bringing the Khmer Rouge $10 to $20 million a month. And undoubtedly was the reason they could carry on fighting their war. But the biggest discovery made was not one we expected to make, which was that the Cambodian government and the Khmer Rouge were collaborating to fight that war. They're collaborating on the timber trade, and both taking a cut of the proceeds. And this word came into our lexicon, corruption. It wasn't a word much used at that time. We were founded legally in 1993, the same year as Transparency International. That was really the pair of us. That's not me saying it. One of our supporters in the past said it. That was the birth of the global anti-corruption movement. And I think in terms of ecocide, corruption is a major part of what allows ecocide to happen, and in part a cause of it, because people are driven by greed. A lot of people are driven by greed.
You've now obviously been working kind of in this arena of exposing corruption and greed across the world for nearly 3 decades. So you've really been pioneers in this arena. When you look at what's happening in the world now and the difference potentially that has been emerging with the growing understanding of the environmental crisis that we're seeing globally, what are you kind of seeing happening in the world from your perspective and the perspective of your work? What do you see changing, if anything?
I think that there have been a lot of changes over that time. Our work, growing from that first foray into the world of deforestation and the cutting of timber for money, extended to sort of 3 broad areas. One of which was a remaining focus on forests. One of which was looking at the trade in conflict resources, and our introduction to that was Blood Diamonds, with the organisation that first uncovered that issue, and then the corruption in the extractive industries. And so we've worked on those 3 areas, but for the purposes of ecocide, well, you could talk about the extractive industries being one, and forests, and then land and environmental defenders coming into the ecocide thing. And I think that when we first started, people knew about cutting down forests bad for the environment. Many organizations long before we were founded, like WWF or Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace, had been talking about forests. We came at it with a slightly new angle, i.e. through the lens of conflict and or corruption, depending on the situation. And my memory of the late 90s, and for probably until around 2007-ish, was that policymakers were not interested in forests. It was just a matter of legality. If a national law allowed a tree to be cut down, it's fine, regardless of its impact on the environment or the people who are dependent on those forests. And that, I think, is gradually changing, with the recognition that to prevent runaway climate change, we have to stop deforestation, absolutely have to stop it. And if we don't, we won't win the climate battle. And that first sort of loomed in people's awareness, I would say people's awareness, policymakers' awareness in the late 2000s, rather late 2010s, around that time. But in the last 4 or so years, that's gone up a lot. There's much more interest in forests, and just in terms of the funding for our organization, you can tell this. We used to scrabble around trying to get any money to fund forests. Now our forest campaign is one of the best ones we've got. We certainly had to put the investment in for a decade or 2 before that happened. So I think there's that awareness. There is much more of an awareness of corruption than there used to be. It used to be regarded as a corruption, that's that terrible thing that happens over there, with a kind of broad gesture towards tropical countries with corrupt governments. Very little admission, certainly a lot of knowledge, but very little admission that actually corruption is a truly globalized industry. And the banks that transfer corrupt money are banks in London, in Frankfurt, in New York. The companies that are paying the bribes in the US or Europe or China. It's truly globalized. So that's much more on the table now. There's various bits of legislation tackling corruption. There's an awareness of it. I don't think that governments have fundamentally changed, though. It's very hard to get convictions or even a successful prosecution of corruption, because it's so complicated, because it's so difficult, and because sometimes these people are the boss of multinational companies or banks. So the vested interests are still all powerful. Greed is all powerful. And I think the real issue, coming to the nub of your question, is that there is an insatiable demand for the world's natural resources, and that's getting worse, in my opinion. The forests are disappearing faster than they used to. People are trying to mine rare earths off the seabed. Everything is open for business. and if you can corrupt some government somewhere, then there's nothing you can't get. And people need to realize that the current economic model, the GDP growth model, is totally unfit for purpose. You cannot have infinite growth in a finite world. It doesn't work. So that has to change. But part of this has to be a law on ecocide, because many of these countries are corrupt. A corrupt country means that the government, if it's a government that has taken the corruption or leading people within it, their affiliation is with the companies that pay the bribes, not with the people who voted them in, if the people indeed had a vote in the first place and it's not a dictatorship, which means that the laws don't apply. So if you're a citizen of one of these countries and you're protesting against deforestation or a mine or a hydroelectric dam, in a corrupt country, the government isn't on your side, the judiciary isn't on your side, and the authority, the military forces or the police are not on your side, which means there's nothing you can do. You are powerless in that sense. You protest, and if you protest, you die. Very often or get attacked. We see that time and again. So that's why I think this international element has to be there.
That's really fascinating. I mean, I watched your TED talk recently from 2014, I believe, and listening to you, it was impossible to know that it was 2014. I mean, everything you were saying felt just as relevant now as it did then. So I can imagine that there must be, a certain level of frustration that, that this is, you've obviously been working around this for decades, and it's still going on, and it's still, and in fact, you've just highlighted that on some levels is getting worse. In terms of a law of ecocide, do you see that also being able to support, for example, environmental defenders on the ground? Is that, because that's a question we get asked quite a lot in terms of the kind of human rights potential impacts of bringing in a law of ecocide. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I have strong thoughts around that, and I think that a law on ecocide would be incredibly valuable to protect those people. We were involved in helping Global Diligence, a small legal outfit run by a guy called Richard Rogers, an international criminal law lawyer, file a complaint on Cambodia, and this was under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court. And a major part of that was the forcible displacement of literally hundreds of thousands of people to make way for economic land concessions, in inverted commas, i.e. let's cut down some forest and build a rubber plantation, grow a rubber plantation. And this was, deals handed out by top politicians to their business cronies. And what you have there is something that could be tried under the Rome Statute, because you've got a clear policy of giving away land or taking bribes to give away land and siding with the businesses or the officials that are doing it, including in the Cambodian case, private companies being able to sponsor military units, which they do. So you think, well, is that a policy or what? So that theoretically...
Am I right in thinking that this filing has been made under crimes against humanity? Is that correct?
Yes. But that complaint that Richard Rogers submitted back in, I think, 2015 resulted in the 2016 policy of the ICC, which actually did allow, made it explicit that some of these crimes could be tried at the International Criminal Court: environmental destruction, land grabbing, forcible displacement, etc. But it's not enough, because you're running this coalition on stopping ecocide. That the environment, the ICC is focused on people. Growing out of Nuremberg as it did, and the world has changed. The other thing I should have said in my answer to you before, the world has changed a phenomenal amount since I've been working on these issues, to the point where we knew about climate change in those days, but it wasn't manifesting itself the way it is now, whether that's the environmental or human impacts of it. We know that what we're doing is unsustainable. Everybody knows, the policymakers know, politicians know. They're just not simply not doing anything. And this issue of intergenerational crime, decisions made today, they're going to affect, generations and generations to come. And there's nothing that can capture that stuff right now. And that's why I think it's really crucial that there needs to be an awareness that humanity is not, something that, is extraneous to the environment. We live in it, we depend upon it. And a lot of people know that. And a lot of indigenous people and forest dependent people, for example, they live and breathe it. You talk to indigenous people about the forest and they go, I am the forest. I've talked to them, we're all one thing. But, here in the West or in various parts of the rich world, we've lost that. And we think, oh, the environment, well, that's kind of just this collateral damage to what we want to do. That has to change, and there has to be a legal manifestation of that. Destroying the environment, both from a purely environmental perspective, but also from humanitarian perspective, has to be illegal at this kind of scale. We're destroying the planet we're living on.
And also interesting as well that there is such a strong link between the sort of greed and corruption and that separate mindset and the ecocides that are taking place. That kind of does show again, I think, that way of thinking is ultimately what the real obstacle is. This Cambodia case, which is now being apparently going to be taken up or at least looked at by the ICC. Do you sort of see that as potentially almost a bridge to the bigger bridge that ecocide law might be?
I think it could be. I think it's a really good complaint about a really important issue, i.e. how a corrupt government can sacrifice the interests of both the country's environment and the bulk of its people for greed, for corruption. No one in the know doubts for a moment that the Cambodian government is as corrupt as any government could be. They're awful. And they've built that on the back of, ripping the natural resources out of their country. And there's no other remedy to it. And I'll take this back a stage. As I said earlier on, when peace came to Cambodia in the early 1990s, it brought to an end decades of civil war. There had been a genocide. Around 10% of the population had been murdered by the Khmer Rouge. The country was absolutely, well, Pol Pot called it year zero, and he wasn't far wrong in terms of what he left of that country. The UN mounted its biggest intervention ever at that time. The international community have ploughed in billions of dollars to try and rebuild that country. And the result is a super rich elite and a poor rural population living in a dictatorship. If the international community really wants to help countries that need help, they can't be done in that way. You can't just provide a load of money, call it development. And I'm not anti-development, I hasten to add, you've got to manage these things well. And the country's, much worse off. Well, I don't know if it's much worse off than it was before, but it's not that much better off than it was 30 years ago. That's a crazy situation. And the environmental impacts are dire. And there is total impunity for the corruption that went on, for the violence that goes on there, which is why I'm very supportive of that whole issue of ecocide at the ICC. And then, rather a long answer to your question, yes, I think this could be opening the door to more things like this. There needs to be a precedent set, and I'd add also that the ICC has not proved to be wildly efficient. But the deterrent effect of an investigation or the indictment of a politician, that's big. Of a business person, that's even bigger. If you're the boss of a company and you suddenly find that you could be standing in the dock and that some war criminal was in the week before, that's a hell of a deterrent. You don't want that publicity. So I think it could be very powerful. And I just wanted to add to something, if I may, that you were mentioning before, in terms of essentially that our way of life in the rich world certainly is completely out of sync with what the world can support. And I've noticed, as as an aging person now, we're at the situation where, for example, the laws protecting democracy are not fit for purpose in the digital age. We've seen that with the Brexit referendum, with the elections in the US and elsewhere in the world, in Kenya, India, where people have been tinkering, micro-targeting people politically on social media, giving them bad information, whatever. The electoral laws weren't up to it. The environmental laws are not up to what's happening now either. It's all a perfect storm of problems like this that need to be tackled. And if I may, adding one more thing to that, in terms of the economic model, my colleague Simon says, half humorously, but he actually means it, that economists should absolutely have to learn about ecology in their training in order to get their economics degree or master's or PhD, because economics has been a science, in inverted commas, that has not taken account of the impact on the environment. The externalized costs on the environment, according to a UNEP report from about 2014, are something like $7 trillion a year. The beef industry in Brazil, its environmental cost in dollars is something like 7 times, don't go on that figure, but something of that order, the revenue that it brings in. This is an absolute indicator of unsustainability. That same report, which I could dig up the reference for you, basically said that virtually no company on the planet would be profitable if it had to pay the costs that they're currently externalizing. Those costs are essentially ecocide. So our model is totally screwed.
That was a very succinct summary. Our model is totally screwed. I think you kind of brought up a number of different things over the course of that answer, and I think that one of the things that it brought up for me, what you were talking about towards the beginning of that intervention, was around the sort of disparity between a sort of very, very rich elite that's benefited from kind of foreign aid and investment, and a grassroots poverty and almost perhaps slavery in some instances, but certainly incredible poverty. And it strikes me that, again, thinking back as well to what you said in your TED talk, that there's a kind of top down and bottom up aspect to this kind of shift in how we perceive things. You mentioned in that talk that the simple solution would be to work with the people on the ground as to what is actually needed. And coming back to the kind of corruption aspect, it's like, because the interventions all sort of remain at the kind of top level of industry and politics, they somehow don't actually reach what's needed on the ground. And I think that's quite interesting from the perspective of what we're doing with the foundation, in that we started off the public campaign, which was founded by myself and Polly Higgins, who, as you know, is no longer with us, with a view to raising funds, kind of crowdfunding, if you like, for moving the sort of diplomatic work forward around ecocide law at the international level, because it was seen still quite a sort of extreme, drastic solution that wasn't attracting, funding. And I really related to what you were saying about the early years of kind of scrabbling around to try and get done what you're doing. But what we found over the last couple of years, which is very interesting, is that we're in this sort of position between the legal and diplomatic developments and the public narrative. But what we're finding is that where there are grassroots conversations going on, there is an influence on the political discourse. And so what we're finding is that where we have campaigns on the ground, which is now in a dozen countries in different forms, we're also finding that the politics, the politicians in those countries are also starting to, the conversation around ecocide is starting to enter the political discourse as well. So and looking at the different things that you ranged over there, would you agree that public narrative has a huge part to play in creating these changes? Because that's very much where we're kind of coming from in terms of kind of building support and raising awareness around what's happening with ecocide. Is that something that does that ring true for you?
Yes, it does, because I think that a lot of what's done is done in the name of the people. The people very often don't have much of a say in that, depending on where you are, or necessarily much of an understanding of what that actually means. And picking up on what you were just saying, I think that, for example, a lot of the bad things that are done in the name of development. And as I said before, I'm certainly not anti-development, but I can't begin to count the conversations I've had when I've gone to a policymaker, say, talking about deforestation and logging, and saying, you simply can't subsidize a country to cut down their rainforest. If a government in a country wants to cut down its rainforest, well, that's perhaps their sovereign right to, but maybe that's where ecocide law comes in. But if they're subsidized to do it, as they very often are by aid programs in Europe, like French support for logging companies in the Congo Basin or whatever, you say, how can you do that? Because you're causing immense environmental harm and human rights abuses. And they're going, but we're bringing wealth to the people. What alternative are you suggesting? And my answer to that was always, have you been there and talked to those people? They're not seeing that wealth. And the forest is going, it's not sustainable, even if you think it is, because it's not. You can see that deforestation is increasing. But because it's sort of under this blanket label of development, it's okay. And most people don't really look beyond that. Most people sort of whose taxes are actually paying those subsidies. Talk to the people on the ground, have a completely different view of what they want. And of course, I can't speak for them, but I have talked to many of them in different parts of the world. And of course, people want a school, a decent road to get to the market, a clinic, things that we take in the rich world for granted, they don't have. And they do want. And a lot of the business that comes their way in terms of whether it's an agricultural concession or a logging contract or whatever, saying, well, if you consent to this, free, prior and informed consent, if you consent to this, then you get the clinic and the school. And well, that's not free. That's not free at all. That's entirely conditional. Those things should be provided by their governments, and they should have a completely free say on what industries can operate in the area that they have traditional rights or straightforward legal rights to. But that we're not in that situation, but it comes under the development banner, so it's okay. So I think there's a very long way of saying the public narrative is all important, and that the people who are most affected should have most say in what happens, in the land around them, and they need, a lot of support to be able to say it, because the political climate may be very difficult to raise those criticisms in, might be physically dangerous. They may not have, they certainly probably won't have the resources to counter the arguments of highly paid corporate lawyers who are saying, oh, well, it's a totally inequitable situation, and that's probably the root of the problem.
Yeah, this makes me think of what happens when you do have decent representation for local people. I'm thinking of the Chevron case in Ecuador, with Pablo Fajardo, Steve Donziger, and others, speaking for the local and indigenous communities, and actually winning a case against this huge oil company now some years ago, and finding that, even though the case took place in the jurisdiction that the oil company chose, and even though that judgment has been backed up in other courts elsewhere around the world, that that oil company still hasn't actually coughed up any of the billions that it was instructed to do, in that court case, and that those lawyers have been effectively pursued by those expensive lawyers, in order to try and overturn it, or avoid somehow actually being held to account. And for us, that really kind of highlights that the importance of a criminal law and of something at the international level, because there's a big difference to how corporations can sort of, or rather the bad actors in those corporations can hide behind the corporate veil, and have the corporation pay for lawyers, or to effectively have even if they do pay any fines, effectively it doesn't actually change the practices themselves. So you're actually, there still fails to be a sort of deterrent, and that's, you brought that up as well, just a few minutes ago, that there isn't in place an enforceable deterrent that can actually affect how people see, how key decision makers see their impact and the potential results of it. I mean, I think you have a very different situation when somebody's, not to put too fine a point on it, if the CEO's art is on the line, then that's a very different, prospective future to one where, okay, the company might have to shell out some money, or might have to shell out some lawyers' fees to avoid shelling out some money. And so, there's a kind of, a very different feeling, and it is actually the feeling. It's about creating the necessary wariness, the necessary fear, the necessary reluctance on the part of those bad actors to move forward with projects that are so destructive. I think there's also what you brought up about economists and ecologists, that they should sort of be both. Makes me think a bit, reminds me of Kate Raworth's work on donor economics, where she talks about how, if you tell me what you want the economy to do, and I will then design the economy around it. I believe she's quoting an economist possibly from China when she said that. But it just shows that we kind of get stuck in these structures that have been built up, these kind of academic and thought structures around how we do things, that become embedded in the kind of whole political economic structure itself, by which we operate, without sort of taking that step back and looking at the bigger design. And what's interesting from my perspective actually is when I've spoken to, for example, parliamentarians, I spoke to some MPs in Westminster about a year ago around ecocide, and what I found interesting was that the tendency was for the politicians to kind of home in on particular projects or very specific areas where they'd say, well, will ecocide law apply to this? For example, I was asked, can we still build HS2 in the UK if we have ecocide law? And in a sense, trying to explain that that's actually not the point. I mean, probably not, because, if you're talking about over 100 ancient irreplaceable woodlands, yes, that probably is an ecocide. But aside from that, what was interesting was the difficulty that they had in kind of taking a sort of broader picture and looking at actually what we're not talking about how you play the game here. We're talking about the rules of the game, and actually kind of getting underneath that. And that was something that it was kind of difficult. It felt difficult to convey in the kind of political mindset that I was encountering. So yeah, I think some really kind of fundamental things that obviously require shifting. And sometimes I think there's also a bit of there's a kind of a despair around that we often come across of people sort of feeling like what's been embedded and has kind of grown up over so long is so difficult to shift that, you know, how can we even think that this is possible? But for me, one of the really inspiring things about your work and what you did was simply you saw the problem and you went, you're like, okay, we haven't done this before, but let's go tackle it and see what we can find out. And one of the things that highlights to me is something around agency. I mean, my feeling is that in our sort of globally dominant culture at the moment, there's not a lot of support for people's understanding that they can actually affect the world. And I think, again, that comes back to the importance of the public narrative, but also the importance of, I suppose, motivating and inspiring people, which I feel very much is something that you've done with your work. In terms of saying, you know, when you can see something that isn't working, something that, you know, brings this level of outrage, you know, what is it that you can do? But also just knowing that there is something that people can do. And I think people often don't have that confidence or that belief, if you like, that it is possible to actually act on what they're experiencing in the world. And I think that's a real, for me, that's another educational piece that's missing. You know, as you were saying with, you know, the ecology and economy, they should be educated together. You know, there's something around the way that our educational system has grown up around the industrialized society of you know, creating a whole bunch of people that can, you know, then work in factories or service industries or whatever it is, you know, that somehow has everybody working towards being a shinier cog in a machine, and perhaps not getting the bigger picture of the machine and kind of going, right, I want to get from A to B, you know, where are my ingredients? How do I do that? You know, that kind of way of thinking is all too rare. And so, I mean, I feel personally extremely inspired by what Global Witness has done and what you did in starting that up and in pursuing that direction. If you were going to I suppose, you know, give a kind of a few words of inspiration to anybody watching this, what might those be, and what would you say to people who, you know, perhaps are feeling a little bit like this is, you know, this is all too much and it's too late, you know, what would you say?
Well, I'm a kind of an angry person and a bit of a fighter, and I actually thoroughly enjoy taking on power. It's not always rewarding, but I think there are two people much more famous than I, because I'm not famous. Margaret Mead was quoted as saying, never believe that a small group of people can't change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And Anita Roddick, who said, if you think you can't make a difference, just try go to sleep in a room with a mosquito in it. You know, you can change things, and obviously people have different skills, different circumstances, but you can absolutely change things. And in fact, looking at sort of global level advocacy, which, you know, we've been involved with for years, very often the policymakers look to, what they need to convince them very often is, are the public concerned? And sometimes it doesn't actually matter if the public are concerned, but if they think they're concerned, then that worries them. So if you're carrying out your advocacy and there's an article in the Financial Times, a policymaker will listen to you because they're assuming people are reading it. And now, you know, with social media, with Twitter, with everything else, that's even more prescient, although sometimes it can be a bit of a saturation. But the bottom line is, you know, we were told you'll never change the diamond industry, you'll never change the oil industry. Well, we did a little bit. And, you know, with allies, you know, of course, not alone. It can be done, and it has to be done. And right now, I think, you know, the school strikes, Greta Thunberg's movement, all of this stuff has shown this massive upswelling of anger and determination. And I think that's really heartening. I mean, I went off and demonstrated when I was a student as well, you know, but I think it's kind of bigger now. My one fear, and it comes back to the system that you were outlining, and I think it was Noam Chomsky who mentioned this, that you know, all of these people go off to university and they suddenly come out of it with, you know, 40 grand debt, and you can't afford to go off and be, you know, a free spirit. You've got to get a job and pay it off, which I think is something that it's not your job or mine to change that, but I think it's something that needs to change so that people can yeah, demonstrate, form an organization. You don't have to form an organization, do it by yourself. Look what you guys did. You know, it can be done. And I think there should be real optimism about it, and I don't think we should let the bastards get away with it. So I think, you know, it's never too late.
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually just made a rather good argument for universal basic income, actually, in my opinion. In the sense of, you know, there should be some kind of, you know, bottom line that everybody globally agrees is simply basic to everybody's ability to exist and to have the basic needs, you know, which is, you know, we have this incredible sort of myth of meritocracy in the West, that, you know, somehow if you work really hard, you know, one day you'll get what you need, and, you know, it'll be because you've worked really hard and that'll make you deserve it. And when you look at actually who's got the most resources, and, you know, it bears very little relation to that whatsoever. And what I've also found, I think, over the years, is that, you know, ordinary citizens are, as you kind of just outlined, often just so busy being able, you know, trying to get bread on the table and feed the kids and pay off debts and all of that, that having any kind of spare mental or emotional energy to actually align actions with values is quite difficult. And, you know, in the arena of change makers, what I've found repeatedly is that there seem to be, you know, it's the people who have somehow or other have the time in their days and in their weeks to address these things, that have the kind of freedom to do that. And that can either be because they're of independent means, or it could be because they've actually opted out of the system completely, which might be your more sort of viewed as extreme kind of on the ground, boots on the ground activists, but also people like, you know, in the beginning, Polly and myself, who worked, you know, I mean, we worked for nothing for years and years, and we happened to have husbands who just about managed to get the bills paid so that we could do that, you know. But essentially what was this, you know, the situation in all of those cases is you actually have to have a bit of space and time in order to take action, because of the system being so self-perpetuating that it keeps you working, you know, your 40 hours or your 50 hours a week or whatever it is, in order to simply kind of meet that sort of tread water, if you like. So I think, and I think that one of the things that these global mobilizations have done, as you mentioned, you know, the school strikes inspired by Greta, but also Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement in the US and others, you know, is to kind of open a window of discussion that has, I think, enabled some movement to happen, you know, at the political level, because it's kind of forced a level of polarization and a level of conversation to happen in the media, and that sort of widened that window and enabled the, you know, the global climate situation or biodiversity loss and these kinds of issues to actually come into living room conversation, which is in turn, certainly from our perspective, I'll be interested to hear from yours, but certainly from the perspective of the Stop Ecocide campaign, you know, we've been saying the same thing for 10 years, ultimately, if you go back to when Polly first started advocating for this, you know, but it's only really in the last just over a year that conversation has no longer been landing on deaf ears, shall we say. And my sense is that is very much thanks to the grassroots mobilizations that we've seen across the world.
Yeah, I think that's in large part true. I think there is, in addition to that, you know, there is a growing awareness of the climate emergency that we're in. But I agree, those grassroots movements have been critically important. And I think that, in my experience, the advocacy that really works when you're trying to sort of get a new law or path is when you have an argument that is inarguable. And I know that sounds obvious, but for example, in the first time it really struck me was the blood diamond work. And you go to a policymaker and say, okay, De Beers and other companies in the diamond industry are trading diamonds. It's resulting in the killing of people in a civil war in Sierra Leone or Angola. That's those stones are being sold quite legally on the streets of London or Brussels. There is no one who can defend that practice. You're on a winner with that. There's no one, nothing you can say. Yeah, okay, you've got child soldiers, kids being killed, blah, blah, blah. And I think that with the school strikes, for example, how can a politician, you've got a double unarguable thing, really, one of which is the basic argument is completely sound. People today are making decisions which are going to screw my life up. I'm a kid now, my world's going to be screwed up by this. The science is on our side. No one can really argue against that unless you're Donald Trump or someone like him. And the other thing they have on their side is their kids. It's for politicians to slag off someone like you or me. Well, that's par for the course. It's very hard to get away with doing it to a kid. Then you just look like an ogre. So more power to them.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we often get asked, who are your biggest detractors? What are your biggest obstacles? And actually, it's not completely dissimilar in the sense that, I mean, obviously, I'm not 17 anymore, regretfully, but
you and me both.
But what we do notice is that, there may be particular corporations who are well aware of what we're doing and would rather prefer it wasn't happening. But are they going to come out publicly and say that? Well, no, because they'll look really crap. So actually, the kind of inarguability is kind of on our side in that way. And I do think that that's going to, and I think it is having a huge impact, and is going to increase in terms of its momentum, I believe, in this context. And I think, again, coming back to the whole sort of narrative thing and a kind of cultural shift that needs to happen, we also often get people asking about what you highlighted earlier about the ineffectiveness of the ICC, and is this really going to make a difference, and so on. And I think Philippe Sands, who is chairing the co-chairing the panel of lawyers who are drawing up this definition, has a very good point when he says that one of the real power, sort of the real potentials in doing this and in creating a criminal law at the top level, regardless of exactly how effective it may be in individual cases, and there surely will be individual cases, is that it sends a hugely strong message. It says to the world, destroying the natural living world is as bad as destroying people. It is a serious crime of concern to the international community as a whole. And of course, we're beginning to see those consequences, playing out in ever more apocalyptic ways. So it's becoming even, ever harder to deny that that's the case. And so, having that actually land as a law at the international level sends a very, very strong message. And it's certainly our hope that what it may actually do is enhance the enforceability and the enforcing, plain and simple, of environmental regulation and environmental crimes generally, because the whole arena of damaging nature will become morally unacceptable. And that's really, I guess, the sort of bottom line around our work. And I think it's also very interesting how that ties in with some of the issues that you've been talking about corruption and greed. And another aspect that I've been recently reading up about as well is the link between ecocide and slavery. And that, we all have very strong sense that slavery is completely and utterly wrong, and that, in fact, proportionally speaking, it's at the lowest it's ever been in terms of a proportion of the global population and so on. But in terms of sheer numbers and sheer impact, it's still huge what's going on in terms of slavery, and it's very closely linked to environmental destruction, because slaveholder operations tend to be, they're unregulated, they're working incredibly, they can be very sort of primitive type operations in terms of what's happening with regard to sort of deforestation or mining or fishing in some cases, for example, the shrimp industry in Bangladesh and other places like this. And so that kind of highlights to me that there is a sort of series of stages here. There's in a way, the kind of foot in the door might be the Cambodia case at the ICC right now, where we're wanting the ICC to just acknowledge that some of these environmental crimes are linked to crimes against humanity, and then kind of moving on to actually legislating for ecocide. And then, because unless that law is in place, it's very difficult to then, point at what's bad about, these outfits that, then are being continued illegally and involving slavery as well. So there's a whole kind of, series of steps that potentially are involved here. Yeah, I don't know whether you've encountered that particular aspect in your work as well.
Yeah, I think that I'm going back to what you're saying about Philip Sands and sort of getting the destruction of the environment as it currently takes place to become morally unacceptable. I think that is what has to happen. We've yet to cross that Rubicon, I guess, in our collective understanding of these things, even though, the numbers are out there on climate change or deforestation or the loss of biodiversity. And I think that the deterrent effect is a critical one. Going back again to something else you said, fines for companies, even if they sound huge in the billions, are a cost of doing business. That's all. If it's Chevron or whether it's a bank who's been caught for money laundering, fraction of their total profits goes off in fines. You do need to get end the impunity of the people who are making the decisions. Then you start really changing things and really doing it quite fast. And I think also that, picking up some of the phrasing you were using, the ICC recognizes the killing of people is bad, and that ecocide will recognize that destroying the environment is bad. But of course, destroying the environment is killing people. And whether that's in a very direct way because they happen to get murdered for protesting against a hydroelectric dam, whatever it might be, or an indirect way, simply because their land becomes unlivable. And then what do you do? So I think all of those things come together. Then this perfect piece of calm weather that makes a crime of ecocide absolutely common sense. Society has to catch up with it. The economic model has to catch up with it. And I think that the COVID pandemic, for me, has proved to be a bit of a light bulb moment, in that on the climate issue, for example, the reason governments are always saying we can't do this, we can't, economically damaging. But the measures they've had to take with COVID, like shutting down hotels, restaurants, stopping people going to work, reducing travel, is tremendously economically damaging. But they had the balls to take those decisions with varying degrees of efficacy depending on where you are, because the threat was so much in their face. That for me is a very useful precedent. The environmental threat is even more serious. It's just still a little bit more invisible. And that's, I think, our collective task is to make it slightly more visible. And I think an ecocide law will really help do that.
Thank you so much, Patrick Alley from Global Witness. To find out more about Patrick's work, please visit globalwitness.org. And to find out more about the international campaign to make ecocide a crime, please visit stopecocide.earth. You can sign our international petition there, or you can join up as an Earth protector to support our work with your funds and your time. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.